My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31 years old. And there's a moment I will never forget, standing in the middle of a bright hotel lobby, suitcase in hand, with every pair of eyes in the room slowly drifting toward me. The woman at the front desk kept apologizing. Her fingers tapped the keyboard over and over, searching, refreshing, hoping the reservation would somehow appear. It never did, because it was never there to begin with. My mother stood just a few feet away, close enough to hear everything, far enough to pretend she wasn't involved. She kept her gaze fixed on the ocean view through the glass, as if the water outside was suddenly the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. Then my sister walked over from the pool bar, drink in hand, smile already on her face. And not the kind of smile that means everything is okay. The kind that means she had been waiting for exactly this moment. She looked me up and down and said, without a trace of guilt, that a failure didn't deserve to travel with this family. No room. No seat at dinner. Not even the basic dignity of being treated like I belonged there. And the worst part? Nobody looked surprised. Not one person at that table, in that lobby, in that family flinched. Because this wasn't a mistake. This had been planned. I had been invited just far enough to be humiliated in public. But here is what they didn't expect. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I simply looked at my mother, then at my sister, picked up my suitcase, and said 2 words. Then I'll leave. The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut glass. Nobody moved. Nobody stopped me. And as I walked out through those glass doors into the warm Florida air, something shifted deep inside me. What they thought was the moment they finally put me in my place was actually the moment everything they had built started to fall apart. I had seen a message 2 days before any of this happened. A cheerful little text from my mother, flight details, the resort address, and a note reminding everyone to be downstairs by 6 for Thanksgiving dinner. But when I looked at the room list, something stopped me cold. 1 room under my uncle's name. 1 under my mother's. 1 under my sister and her husband's. Mine wasn't there. I stared at the screen for a full minute. Then I texted back, calm, simple. I don't see my room. My mother replied 10 minutes later. Just 5 words. The hotel is still sorting details. Just come. No explanation. No apology. No reassurance. Just come. A younger version of me would have pushed harder. A younger version of me still believed that asking the right question could fix the wrong situation. But after years of being treated like the family disappointment, I had learned how they operated. They always stayed vague when they were hiding something ugly. Still, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. My uncle was the one who had paid for the trip. He believed in keeping the family together, even when the rest of us were barely pretending anymore. So I packed my suitcase, boarded my flight from Austin, and tried to convince myself I was overthinking it. The moment I stepped into that hotel lobby, I knew I wasn't. The front desk clerk's expression said everything before her words did. Confused first, then embarrassed. She clicked through screens, lowered her voice, and glanced up at me with that careful look people use when they know bad news is about to land somewhere it will hurt. I could feel my mother nearby before I even turned to look. She was standing close enough to hear every word, but not close enough to be forced into helping me. And then my sister appeared, pool bar drink still in hand, smiling like she had spent all morning looking forward to exactly this. She didn't pretend there had been a misunderstanding. She said it plainly. Yeah, we didn't book one for you. Then she laughed softly and added the word that hit harder than anything else. Failure. I had heard versions of that word for years. I was the daughter who left the respectable path. The sister who didn't marry the right kind of man. The woman who lived in a small apartment and paid her bills through client invoices instead of posting curated holiday photos online. But hearing it out loud, in public, while my mother said nothing and strangers pretended not to listen, something inside me went completely still. That was the moment I stopped trying to understand them. I picked up my suitcase, looked at my mother, looked at my sister, and said the only thing left to say. Then I'll leave. My sister's smile flickered. Just once. Maybe she had expected tears. Maybe she had expected me to beg, or argue, or break down in front of everyone. Instead, I gave her something she wasn't prepared for. I gave her nothing. I turned and walked out into the Florida afternoon, and behind me, the lobby went so quiet it almost felt sacred. What I didn't know yet was that someone had heard every single word from the second-floor balcony directly above us. And by the time I reached the curb outside, the real Thanksgiving story had already begun. I was already pulling up the right app when my phone buzzed. Most people in that moment would have expected a text from my mother. Maybe a half-hearted explanation. Maybe my sister sending something sarcastic just to twist the knife a little deeper. But the name on my screen was neither of them. It was my uncle. And something about seeing his name in that moment, standing alone outside a resort I hadn't been given a room in, suitcase at my feet, holiday flights already running through my head, made me pause. I almost didn't answer. Not because I didn't love him, but because I was so exhausted from explaining myself to people who had already made up their minds about me. I didn't have the energy to perform okayness for one more person. But I picked up anyway. "Claire, where are you?" His voice was calm, steady, but there was something underneath it, something tighter than his usual tone, that made me sit up straighter, without even realizing it. "I'm outside," I said. "I'm heading back to the airport." There was a brief pause. Then he said 3 words I wasn't expecting. "Stay where you are." He came outside less than 3 minutes later. Still wearing the linen blazer he always put on when he wanted to look both relaxed and untouchable at the same time. He sat down beside me on the bench, without making a production of it. No dramatic entrance. No loud questions. He just sat down, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't offer me that soft, useless comfort people give when they want credit for caring without actually doing anything. Instead, he looked at me directly and asked the one question that actually mattered. "Tell me exactly what she said." So I told him. Every word. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't soften my mother's silence into something kinder than it had been. I didn't skip the part where strangers in the lobby had looked away because witnessing it made them uncomfortable. I told him the truth, plainly and completely, the way I had never been allowed to in that family, without someone calling me too sensitive or too dramatic. When I finished, he looked out at the road for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that carries weight, and said something I will probably carry with me for the rest of my life. People who build their whole image on borrowed money always panic in front of someone who still has dignity without it. I turned toward him. He was still staring ahead. And before I could respond, before I could even process what he had just said, he continued, "Don't apologize for someone else's cruelty." Then he pulled out his phone, made 2 calls, and with the kind of quiet authority that never needs to raise its voice, he changed the course of the next 48 hours completely. First, he booked me a room. Same resort. Same floor as everyone else. Then he asked me to come to Thanksgiving dinner the following evening, exactly as originally planned. I told him I didn't want a confrontation. I meant it. I had no interest in dramatic scenes or screaming matches. I had already said everything I needed to say the moment I walked out of that lobby. He gave me the faintest smile and said, "Good. Neither do I. But here is what I want you to understand, because this is the part that changes everything. What my uncle wanted was not a confrontation. He didn't want shouting or accusations or a messy family argument that everyone could later reframe as a misunderstanding. What he wanted was something far more precise. Something my sister and my mother had never once considered possible because they had spent so many years believing there were no real consequences for how they treated me. He wanted accountability, delivered quietly, in front of everyone, with no exit. And the next evening, sitting in a private dining room overlooking the water, with long candles flickering down the center of the table and crystal glasses catching the light, he delivered it exactly that way. If you have ever sat at a table with people who humiliated you and watched them act like nothing happened, keep reading. Because what came next was not something any of them saw coming. And it started the moment my uncle set down his fork, dabbed the corner of his mouth with his napkin, and slowly rose to his feet. Nobody tapped a glass. Nobody asked for attention. He simply stood up, and the entire room shifted around him like gravity had quietly changed directions. The dinner had moved along exactly the way I expected it would. Polished and hollow. Wine poured too early. Small talk passed around the table, like a dish nobody actually wanted to eat. My sister had arrived dressed like she was attending a magazine shoot rather than a family dinner, her smile wide and practiced. Her husband sat beside her wearing that tense, careful expression men get when they sense something is wrong but are still hoping appearances will hold everything together. My mother greeted me with a stiff nod, the kind you give someone you work with but don't respect. Not a word about the lobby. Not a flicker of acknowledgement. Nothing. They had all collectively decided that because I had shown up to dinner, the previous day had simply dissolved. That my walking out, my silence, my dignity, none of it had meant anything because here I was, still at the table. I almost admired how completely they believed that. Then my uncle stood up, and the room went still in a way that had nothing to do with manners. "I have supported this family for a long time," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, the way voices sound when the person speaking has absolutely nothing to prove. "Longer than most of you will ever admit out loud." My sister's hand froze around her wine glass. My mother's expression shifted, almost too small to notice, but I had spent a lifetime reading her face, and I caught it. He continued without pausing. "I paid for this trip because I believed the least we owed each other was basic decency. Instead, I watched one member of this family be humiliated in a hotel lobby over a room that should have been waiting for her all along." He turned and looked directly at my sister. She opened her mouth immediately, already reaching for the explanation she had probably rehearsed, that it had been a joke, a misunderstanding, that stress had made her say things she didn't mean, that surely everyone at the table could see she hadn't intended it the way it sounded. He stopped her with a single glance. "No," he said. "You were not joking. You were performing status at someone else's expense." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the faint sound of cutlery from the kitchen on the other side of the door. Nobody at that table moved. Nobody breathed too loudly. And in that silence, my uncle reached into his jacket pocket, removed a folded piece of paper, and placed it on the table in front of him. "Since clarity seems overdue, let me be clear." He looked around the table slowly. Then he said the words that cracked the entire foundation of the life my sister had been performing online for years. "Effective immediately, all discretionary financial support I have been providing to this family ends today." My mother whispered his name like a warning. He ignored her completely. "Monthly transfer stop. The supplemental tuition payments for your daughter's private school stop. The housing assistance arrangement I agreed to back in 2021 will not be renewed or extended in any form. If you want your lifestyle to continue, you may fund it yourselves." My sister went white so fast it was startling. Her husband tried to speak. His voice cracked on the very first word. "Sir, maybe we should discuss this privately." My uncle looked at him without blinking.
"Calm."
"Absolute." "Was her treatment of Claire private?" he asked. "Or was it public enough for the hotel staff and half the lobby to hear?" That shut him down completely. My mother leaned forward, voice tight and shaking. "This is extreme. It was a misunderstanding." "No," my uncle replied. "A misunderstanding is when truth gets lost. Yesterday, I heard the truth very clearly." Then he said the one thing that broke the illusion entirely. The sentence that named exactly what had been happening in that family for years, said plainly and without cruelty, in front of everyone. "The people at this table have confused support with entitlement for years. Worse, you have mistaken borrowed comfort for personal superiority. You look down on the only person here who knows how to stand on her own feet." My sister started crying, but not in a way that made anyone feel sorry for her. It was the panicked, desperate crying of someone watching the floor disappear beneath a life they had always assumed was permanent. Her husband stared down at his plate, already calculating. My mother looked older in that moment than I had ever seen her, smaller, somehow, like the image she had always projected was a coat that had just been taken from her shoulders. And me? I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't lean over and whisper anything satisfying into my sister's ear. I just sat there, completely still, and felt something I had not felt in the presence of my family in a very long time. I felt untouchable. My uncle folded the paper, returned it to his pocket, lifted his wine glass, and said simply, "Happy Thanksgiving." Nobody touched dessert. But here is the part nobody talks about when these moments happen. The dinner ending was not the end. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Because the next morning the calls started. And what my family said, and what they refused to say, revealed more about them than anything that had happened in that lobby or at that dinner table. The consequences had arrived. And they were only just getting started. They say you never really know how people see you until the moment you stop being useful to them. I learned that on a Friday morning in a hotel room in Florida, sitting on the edge of a perfectly made bed with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching my phone light up over and over again like a warning system nobody had bothered to install until it was already too late. The first call came before I had even finished my coffee. My mother. I let it ring out. She called again. Then my sister. Then her husband. By noon, I had 11 missed calls and 6 text messages, all of them circling the same desperate core, just wrapped in different packaging depending on who was sending it. My mother's version was emotional, pleading. She called me twice before switching to voicemails that got progressively softer, like she was adjusting her strategy in real time based on what wasn't working. Her husband's version was practical, measured. He texted asking if perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about what my uncle had actually meant, and whether a conversation between everyone might help clarify things. It was the kind of message a man sends when he is already on the phone with his bank in his head and needs someone else to fix the problem before the numbers get worse. But my sister's version, her version was the most revealing thing any of them sent me that entire weekend. She texted, "I cannot believe you sat there and let him do that to us." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, slowly, because I wanted to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Let him do that to us. Not, "I cannot believe I said what I said in that lobby." Not, "I am sorry for humiliating you in front of strangers." Not even a single word that acknowledged what she had actually done. Just raw, unfiltered outrage that consequences had shown up faster than she had expected, and that somehow, in her version of the story, I was the one who had caused them. That text told me everything I needed to know about how much had actually changed. And I put my phone face down on the nightstand and left it there. Here is what I want you to understand, because this matters more than the drama of missed calls and desperate messages. The people who treat you the worst are often the same people who are the most shocked when the world stops protecting them from the results of their own behavior. They have spent so long operating without consequences that when consequences finally arrive, they genuinely cannot locate the source. They look everywhere except inward. They call it unfair. They call it extreme. They call it a misunderstanding. They will call it anything except what it actually is, the natural result of years of choices finally landing exactly where they were always going to land. I flew back to Austin the next day, and by the time I landed, the full shape of the damage had begun to surface. My uncle had never been a man who made empty threats. The monthly financial transfers stopped immediately. The private school tuition payments stopped. And the quiet backup support he had provided years earlier during my sister's home purchase, the kind of behind-the-scenes financial reassurance that makes banks comfortable and mortgages manageable, that was gone too. Completely. Without warning or replacement. Suddenly, the house my sister had spent years photographing from its best angles, the house that appeared in every holiday reel and gratitude caption, started looking less like evidence of success and more like an extremely expensive trap built on a foundation that had just been quietly removed. Her husband emailed me 4 days later. No subject line. It was the most honest communication I had received from anyone in that branch of my family in years. He wrote that they were in serious trouble. He wrote that they had structured too much of their life around money they had slowly started treating as permanent, as if my uncle's generosity was simply a feature of their existence rather than a choice he could withdraw at any moment. He wrote that my sister was panicking, that the bank had started asking questions he wasn't prepared to answer. And at the very end, in a tone that tried hard to sound casual and failed completely, he asked whether I thought my uncle might reconsider if enough time passed. I read the email once. Then I closed it and didn't respond. My mother tried a completely different approach. First, she called angry, accusing me of turning my uncle against the family, as though I had somehow engineered the entire situation from a hotel curb with a suitcase and a ride app. When that didn't produce the reaction she was looking for, she shifted strategies entirely. She called sad. She cried into the phone and told me my sister wasn't sleeping, that her daughter was confused and asking questions nobody knew how to answer, that the stress was putting pressure on everyone in ways that were starting to show. Listening to her describe all of it was like hearing someone explain a house fire in great detail while carefully refusing to mention the match. Finally, after she finished, I said the only true thing I had left to say. I didn't do this. She went silent. And in that silence, in the way she breathed and said nothing, I heard something I had never quite heard from her before. She knew I was right, and she hated me for being right far more than she had ever hated me for being what she called a failure. 2 weeks later, I found out my niece was being pulled from her private school at the end of the term. That monthly tuition payment had been one of many beautiful fictions holding their image together. My sister's social media went quiet almost overnight. The brunch photo stopped. The anniversary trip post stopped. The carefully lit holiday reels with captions about gratitude and blessings and family, all of it just disappeared, like a television that had been switched off mid-broadcast. About who they were. Stay with me, because part 6 is where the real ending lies. And it is not the ending anyone expected, including me. It was remarkable, in a way, how quickly luxury evaporated when it had never truly belonged to the person displaying it. Then my mother left me a voicemail one Friday night that I still remember almost word for word. Her voice was tired in a way I had never heard before. She said, "Natalie is falling apart, Claire. Please. If not for me, then for the little girl." I sat at my kitchen counter after a long day of client work and listened to it twice. And for a brief moment, just a flash, I felt the old reflex stir in me, that deeply trained instinct to smooth things over, to be the easier daughter, the quieter sister, the one who swallowed the insult whole so that everyone else could keep calling themselves a close family without having to examine what that word actually cost me. Then I thought about the lobby, the front desk clerk lowering her eyes, my mother standing close enough to hear every word and choosing, deliberately, to say nothing. My sister's voice hitting that word, failure, in a room full of strangers. I called my mother back, and I said the only honest thing there was left to say. I can't fix something I didn't break. She inhaled sharply, like she had been slapped. But I wasn't being cruel. I was simply finished. And there is a very important difference between those two things, a difference my family had never once given me credit for understanding. The question is, after everything, after the lobby and the dinner and the phone calls and the slow collapse of everything they had built, did any of them ever truly change? Or did they just get quieter? Winter in Austin is mild enough that you can almost forget the rest of the world is cold. But that winter, I felt the season anyway. Not in the temperature, in the clarity, in the way life sometimes strips away the noise and leaves you standing in your own kitchen at 7 in the morning, coffee in hand, realizing that the life everyone told you wasn't enough is actually the only one in the room still standing. While my family was busy explaining themselves to creditors, schools, and each other, mine kept moving forward. Quietly, without applause, in the almost boring, deeply satisfying way that genuinely stable lives tend to do. I signed a long-term contract with a software startup that needed ongoing content strategy work. Another existing client expanded my role after a campaign performed significantly better than expected. And one Sunday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop open, I updated my income spreadsheet and realized I had crossed a number I used to daydream about hitting during the years my family was calling me a disappointment. Nobody applauded. Nobody posted about it. Nobody sent a congratulations text. Nobody even knew except me. And somehow, that made it feel more solid than anything I had ever been handed or praised for in that family. Because it was completely, entirely mine. No one had funded it. No one could take credit for it. And no one could take it away. My uncle called a few times that winter. Never to gossip. Never to relitigate the Thanksgiving dinner or ask me to pick sides or update me on the latest crisis unfolding across the family. He mostly asked about work, about my apartment, whether I was sleeping enough, whether I had started thinking bigger about what I wanted next. One afternoon, he said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that whole season. "Your sister never understood," he said quietly. "She thought success was whatever made strangers envy the fastest." He let that sit between us for a moment. Then he added, "But real success is what still stands after the applause leaves." I wrote that down after we hung up. I still have it. The updates from my family continued filtering in through mutual relatives and occasional messages, each one carrying the same bitter lesson wrapped in different details. My niece had transferred to public school. My sister resented the change more for how it looked than for how it affected her daughter, which told me that even in the middle of losing everything, her first instinct was still about image. Her husband was attempting to renegotiate their mortgage, buying time the way people do when they have run out of other options. My mother had downsized into a smaller place, quietly, without announcing it, because the woman who had always performed a bigger life than she could afford had finally run out of room to perform. Every now and then, she sent me short, awkward messages. The kind that circled around accountability without ever quite landing on it. Things like, "I see some things differently now." Or, "Life has a way of humbling people." I noticed she still struggled deeply with the one sentence that actually mattered. I was wrong. Those 3 words never came. Not directly, not cleanly, and I stopped waiting for them. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about families like mine. The opposite of love between relatives is not always hatred. It is not always screaming or cruelty or obvious rejection. Sometimes, and this is the version that does the most damage because it is the hardest to name, the opposite of love is usefulness. As long as I was the less successful daughter, the cautionary tale, the one whose life made everyone else feel more complete by comparison, they kept me close enough to compare against and far enough away to dismiss. I was useful to their story. The moment I refused that role, the moment I stopped auditioning for a place at a table that had never truly been set for me, the entire structure shifted. They didn't just lose their financial support that Thanksgiving. They lost their mirror. And once that was gone, they had no choice but to look directly at themselves, at what they had actually built, at what it had actually cost, at who they actually were beneath the images and the captions and the borrowed comfort they had been calling success. I wish I could tell you that realization made me deeply sad. Mostly, it made me free. Because the same family who had spent years pointing at my life as proof of failure, the small apartment, the freelance invoices, the absence of a curated online presence, were now being forced into exactly that kind of life themselves. Paying close attention to budgets. Making decisions based on reality instead of appearance. Living without a safety net to quietly absorb every bad habit and overextended purchase. They had called that life embarrassing when it was mine. Now they were calling it maturity when it became theirs. And that right there was almost funny. Almost. The message from my sister arrived on a Tuesday night in early spring while I was boiling pasta and listening to a podcast with one earbud in. It was not a call, which told me she still didn't fully trust herself to hear my voice in real time. It was not a formal email either, which meant it had taken more genuine courage than her usual polished, composed messages did. It was a simple text, unformatted, unpolished, the kind of message that gets written and deleted several times before finally being sent. "I've been thinking about what I said at the hotel. I know sorry doesn't undo it, but I've thought about it every single day since." I stood at my kitchen counter, wooden spoon still in my hand, steam rising from the stove, and read those words twice. Months earlier, I might have imagined this moment differently. Bigger. Sharper. I might have pictured myself crafting the perfect response, something precise and devastating, something that landed with exactly the weight she had once landed on me in that lobby. I won't pretend the thought had never crossed my mind during those long months of silence. But I had learned something important during that winter. Revenge is not always most satisfying when it is loud. Sometimes the deepest, most complete form of it is simply this: letting people live long enough to fully understand what they destroyed with their own hands, while you continue building something they cannot touch. I typed one reply. I know. Then I put the phone down and finished making dinner. Not because what she did was small. Not because one text message had somehow repaired years of damage in a single moment. And certainly not because I had magically healed from the accumulation of being told, in 100 different ways, over 100 different moments, that I didn't belong, didn't measure up, didn't deserve a room, a seat, a place. I replied that way because I no longer needed her pain to confirm my worth. She had already lost the stage she used to perform on. The life she had weaponized against me had cracked. The image had collapsed. And I was still here in my apartment, in my own peace, cooking my own dinner, paying my own bills, building something that no one had funded and no one could ever take credit for dismantling. That was enough. That was more than enough. Real repair in families, when it comes at all, does not happen because one person finally sends a text after the consequences arrive. Real repair is slower and harder and more honest than that. It requires truth. It requires changed behavior that shows up consistently over time, not just in moments of desperation. It requires the humility to stop rewriting the past in ways that flatter the people who caused the damage. I did not know yet whether my sister was truly capable of that kind of change. I did not know whether my mother would ever fully say out loud what her silence in that lobby had cost me. But for the first time in my life, I understood with absolute clarity that I did not have to wait for them to become better people before allowing myself to feel whole. I didn't need their version of the story to change in order to live well inside my own. And that was the real ending they never saw coming. They thought power meant deciding who belonged, who got invited, who received a room, who deserved a seat at the table. They spent years exercising that power over me like it was a birthright. But the truth is, people only hold that kind of power over you for as long as you keep asking them to use it kindly. The second you stop asking, the second you simply walk away with your suitcase and your dignity and your 2 quiet words, the whole structure begins to rot from the inside. My old gray suitcase still sits in the back of my closet. It is cheap and a little scratched, and nothing about it looks impressive. I love it for exactly that reason. Because the last time I wheeled it through a hotel lobby, someone told me I didn't deserve to travel with this family. Next time I take it out, I'll be going somewhere I chose on a ticket I bought, to a room that no one can take from me. And if that is what failure looks like, I will take it every single time.